Hi, Mrs. Bradley here, and today's video tutorial is going to be about how to answer the narrative question featured on the American West section of Paper 2. This question is worth 8 marks, as you can see here on the mark scheme, and you should spend no longer than 12 minutes on this question. Here is an example of a question that you will see in the exam, and one we will be looking at today in this tutorial. As you can see, it is a narrative account analysing the main developments in US government policy towards the Plains Indians in the period 1830 to 1851 that it wants you to give. Like other questions, it gives you some bullet points, hints for what you can include in the answer, and you may include these. However, you must also include some information of your own, otherwise there will be no access to level 3 if you do not go beyond these given parameters. A narrative account is somewhat like a story, but it's a chronological story, as we'll look at in the later slide, and it's one that needs you to make links between your points and have some analytical connectives for it to achieve full marks. As we've just mentioned, this is a narrative account that the exam board wants you to give. A narrative writing has a sequential order. This means that you need to give the events in the correct order. You will need to give detail about each event, and more importantly, you will need to use linking words between each event to show how they follow on from one another. You may have seen this in your classroom, or your teacher may have used it to explain how to answer this question. Chronolink. This is the idea that you write chronologically, and between each event you link one onto another. It is useful to remember this when you are thinking about writing an answer to this question. And remember, you have 12 minutes to write your answer. This is a simple structure and some starting sentences and connectors that could help you to answer this question. Remember, this question wants you to explain or give a narrative account about the development in US policy towards the Plains Indians between 1830 and 1851. To answer this question, we will need to follow the different US policy developments between 1830 to 1851. We will need to do this chronologically, and the hexagon diagram here with its flowing arrows between shows us just how we can do that with sentence starters and connectives that will help us. The start of your narrative account should be the first event that happens in your narrative. For this instance, it was the US policy towards the Plains Indians, and their first action in 1830 was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. You will need to give details of this act and its impact. You can use connectives such as these on the right hand side here. This necessitated the passing of. The next step was to. Therefore this led to. Whichever you decide, the next paragraph should move on to the next element of the narrative account, which should be sequentially in chronological order. So let's do a knowledge check. What knowledge would you need to answer this question in the exam? You would need knowledge of government policy between 1830 to 1851. So let's see what you can include. At the start of your narrative, you can include the 1830 Indian Removal Act. This established a permanent Indian frontier in the west and allowed the removal of South Indian nations so their lands could be available for settlement. This led to the Trail of Tears, where thousands died after being forcibly removed from their lands. Leading on from this, you could include that the 1840s and 50s, the white Americans kept travelling to the west but settled beyond the permanent Indian frontier. This became a pressing matter for both white Americans and Plain Indians for them to have protection. In 1851, there was the Indians Appropriations Act. This set up a legally recognised territory or reservations for Plains Indians to protect them from western expansion. However, this also included the US government policy to focus on trying to civilise them and to confine the Indians to certain areas. Finally, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 was between the US government and the Plains Indians nations. It was an agreement that the Indians promised safe passage to whites in return for an agreed hunting area and annual payments from the government. As a result of the Fort Laramie Treaty, there was a period of peace between the Plains Indians and white settlers. However, the federal government doesn't uphold the treaty when white settlers begin moving into the area of Colorado belonging to the Plains Indians. The Plains Indians' future and life is forever changing in this period. Bearing in mind what you have learnt in class and the knowledge on the previous slide, we have created a model answer trying to show you how to use opening sentences, connectives, and analytical phrases to show that you are creating a narrative, but also an analytical narrative. Why don't you pause the video and have a look at how we have structured the information. If you look at each of the first paragraphs, you can see that we use an opening. In the initial one, the first main development in the US government policy to show focus on the question, and we're beginning at the beginning of the time period. And then each one use a connective and an opening sentence that shows that you're going on to the next step and you're talking about the next bit of the time period and where you are heading. Throughout, you will also see blue highlighted areas that are connectives that allow you to analyse in the narrative, not just explain it. This act allowed, this act established, therefore this led to, in return, and these will help you to show that you are analysing throughout your narrative. Most importantly, you will notice that this is in chronological order and that these different events are connected throughout and linked to create a whole narrative. This question is worth 8 marks in total. You will get 4 marks for your knowledge and understanding of the features and characteristics, and 4 marks for the analytical narrative, showing analysis of cause, consequence, and change. If you have limited knowledge and very little analysis, you will achieve 1 to 2 marks. If you are given narrative with some organisation and some idea of leading to an outcome, with accurate and relevant information with some knowledge shown, you will receive between 3 to 5 marks. If you give a narrative which organises material in a clear sequence of events with a clear outcome, analysing and linking between, with accurate and relevant information including showing a good range of knowledge, you'll achieve 6 to 8 marks. Don't forget that you are only supposed to spend 12 minutes answering this question. If you would like to practice, don't forget to go back to your American West revision guide and find the different question types at the end of each chapter and find different types of the narrative account questions that you can practice.